Howdy again, everybody. This is Doc with Thoroughfan, and usually about once a week we end up reading about a horse that has a post-race sample or an out-of-competition testing sample come back positive for a substance, either a banned substance that they never really should have had in their system to begin with, or an overage of a therapeutic medication. And you know, the reports usually go into some basic detail. The urine or blood sample was sent out to the lab, and the lab ran the sample and came back with these results. But I don't think most people, myself included in this, truly understand the intricacies of the drug testing process on blood or urine and all of the steps that are involved and all of the quality control checks that are involved in ensuring that that sample is tested rigorously and that what they find, if they find anything in those samples, is validated and can be backed up. Because obviously once these positive samples go on, they're usually litigated in the regulatory realm, which in most states now is HISA HIWU, with the exception of a few states because of that pending legal litigation and Supreme Court case and all that stuff. But I really wanted to try to understand it a little bit better and be able to bring to you guys, the fans and handicappers and those that are interested, the exact process of, I wanted to know what happens to that blood or urine sample from the moment it hits the laboratory doors all the way through the process. Each step, incremental step that's done until it's declared clean and not containing anything that's of a concern, or is found to have a substance of some kind that is a concern. So I decided to take a little trip from my warm cabinous abode here in northeastern Pennsylvania, traveled south for a couple of hours to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and in Harrisburg is the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Agriculture houses the offices of the Bureau Director for Thoroughbred Racing, the Bureau Director for Standardbred Racing, as well as the investigative offices of the Pennsylvania Horse Racing Commission. It is also the location where the monthly meetings of the Pennsylvania State Horse Racing Commission take place. And I was really fortunate to be able to set up an interview and a little bit of a sit down with Dr. Mary Robinson, who is the director of the testing lab that runs all of these samples on horses that race in Pennsylvania. And she was most gracious with her time and really took the time to explain everything in a very detailed but easy to understand way. So I hope everybody really enjoys this sit down interview that we had with Dr. Robinson. It's going to be in two parts. The first part, which we'll be showing you now, it kind of goes over the very basics of what happens to that sample from the moment it hits the doors all the way through the lab testing process to the end. And at the end, we also talk a little bit about hair testing. And while it does help in a lot of ways and it can be a way of detecting certain drugs, probably not going to be in the mainstream yet. So hope everybody enjoys part one of this interview with Dr. Mary Robinson as we dive a little bit deeper into the world of drug testing and the laboratory process for racehorses around the country. So we are here at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, where the Horse Racing Commission meets monthly, and I am very pleased to be joined by Dr. Mary Robinson, a veterinarian and the director, I believe I'm saying that right, of the PETRL lab. So what does PETRL stand for?
So PETRL is the Pennsylvania Equine Toxicology and Research Laboratory, and that's where we perform all the drug testing for horses that are racing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Okay, and so a lot of the fans out there know, we've kind of gone over a little bit already, the process of obtaining the samples from the horses. So it's usually either blood or urine, and of course there's a whole chain of custody process that happens with that, that we've shown in previous videos. Where the sample is labeled and then put into a container that is sealed and then shipped off to the laboratory for testing. So what we wanted to do was kind of go through what happens after that. So when a sample actually arrives at the lab, what the process is, that kind of tube of blood or urine, what it goes through to either determine if the test is clean or the test is positive. So that's where Dr. Robinson comes in. She has a lot of experience in this and has been instrumental in a lot of research as well in developing new tests and working with the people at the lab. So when you guys get a sample, what is kind of the first thing that you'll do, in the testing process?
Sure. So the samples arrive by a courier service, so we know to expect them. We have in our LIMS, which stands for Laboratory Information Management System, we have a list of samples that we're expecting, and then when the courier arrives, my staff meet them at the door. They have paperwork that they sign off so that we have signatures to keep that chain of custody intact. That's really, really important, of course. The container itself has a padlock on it, and it also has something called an aluminum seal that there's really no way to remove the seal unless you cut it, and it has a number on it. So each container comes with a specific number assigned to it. So my staff will take that into our what we call login room, where we bring the samples. We have a computer system there that we use a scanner to scan the barcode on each sample that's in the container, verify that all of the samples that we were expecting to receive were received and are in good condition. So they look at the sample, make sure that it's sealed properly, that there's not significant hemolysis or anything else that would potentially affect the testing. And then once those samples are logged in, that's when we can start doing our testing after that.
Okay, so, and I think a lot of people know this already, but just to confirm, you guys, there's no identification of the individual animals on that, right?
Correct.
Basically, that number is just a number for tracking through the system.
Absolutely. The barcode is all that we receive, so we don't know which horse, which trainer. That's the only information we get is that barcode number.
Okay, that's good to know. So now, obviously, you've got all that stuff in the system, and you've got either your tube of blood or urine. What happens to those tubes next? Like, what is the initial testing process for them?
So the first thing that we do is something called an extraction. So there's lots of different extraction procedures that we use for both the blood and the urine samples. These extraction procedures pull out different types of chemicals. So some extraction procedures work best for some types of drugs. Other extraction procedures work best for other types of drugs. So we use multiple different extraction procedures to get the best coverage of all the different types of drugs that are out there. After extraction, then there are also multiple screening methods. And a screening method is simply, it's a multiplex method, so there's lots of different chemicals in that method that are similar in their chemical makeup. That we can look for all at the same time in a single method. And so we have probably, there's some screening methods that have over 500 drugs in a single method. Others are more specialized, and so they have a smaller number of drugs. But after extraction, all of the samples then go to these multiple screening methods. And the screening method is then what tells us if we have a suspect or not. If there is a suspect, then that sample is pulled aside and we target that for a confirmation test.
Okay, so when you kind of use the term extraction, is that just removing the sample from the tube, or are there other processes that are involved in?
No. So my apologies. Extraction
okay.
is actually partly you do have to pipette out the amount of urine or blood. In our cases, we either use serum or plasma for the blood from the blood sample. So we take that out of the tube into another separate tube, and then there's various chemicals that are added to the tube in order to mix with the sample, and that partitioning of the drugs into those chemicals is what allows us to pull them out of the serum or the blood or the urine.
Okay, and when you're doing that kind of initial screening test, is there a specific machine or type of process that you're using for that? And I'm assuming when you say like you're just screening, you're not actually looking for specific number levels, you're just looking for evidence of the substance being in that sample, right?
That's correct, yes. So we have lots of different mass spectrometers. There's different types that are optimized depending on the actual machine itself. There's different types of mass specs that you can use. And so we have different screens on different mass specs that these samples then end up going to. So once the extraction is performed, that is ready to go into a sample vial that is going to go onto what's called an auto sampler. So it's essentially, it looks like a little tiny tube, and then when you put it on the auto sampler, that program in the computer then tells the auto sampler, okay, take this much out of that tube and inject it into what's called usually a liquid chromatograph. So we have both liquid chromatography and gas chromatography at the lab, and those are simply two different ways to try and take that extracted part of the sample and then separate out the drugs and substances in it even further. So when we run that sample through with a column that's on that liquid or gas chromatography instrument, as the sample is running through the column, the drugs can bind to that column with different affinities, different strengths essentially. And then the solvents that are also running through that column, or in gas, gas chromatography, it would be gas. That is going to then cause the different substances to come out of the other side of the column at different time points, and that's called retention time. So the amount of time it stays in that column is unique to each chemical, and is the retention time for that chemical. So that's one of our first identifying pieces of information as to whether we have a substance in the sample of interest. Once it goes through the column and comes out of the other side of the chromatographic instrument, then it goes into the mass spectrometer. And the mass spectrometer is essentially a way to detect the size and the charge of the different chemicals that are in the sample. It's lots of fancy physics that I cannot explain.
I think few people probably could when you really break it down.
But at the end of the day, there's a detector on that instrument that gives us the size and the charge of the different compounds that we're looking for. We can see both the intact parent drug. For example, if it's phenylbutazone, you'll see the whole phenylbutazone molecule. The next part of that is that the instrument itself, you can apply like some energy, and I don't exactly, again, know the physics behind it, but it breaks up that drug into pieces, and then those individual pieces provide what are called fragments. So we can see the mass and the charge of those different fragments as well. And that's when you hear someone talk about like the fingerprint of the drug. It's essentially the retention time, and then the intact mass that it's being detected, and then all the masses and charges for those different fragments that you can detect that are unique to that specific drug. So that's how we end up with a suspect, and suspect that drug is in the sample from a screening test.
So when I guess at the end when you get those results from the screening test, does it come out in a readout that specifically tells you the compound, or is it more of just like a graph that then you have to interpret? Like, how does?
Yeah, so historically you would have to manually go through and look at for each drug that you're interested in, and that's called targeted drug testing. So we have people that are just very skilled at looking at all of this data that come out of the instrument. We are working on getting AI to do that for us. So that's one of the things actually I'm going to be presenting at the Racing Commission later this afternoon, is some of the advances that we've made using another program and artificial intelligence to do that data review essentially for us. And then it gives us kind of, okay, here's a suspect, here's not.
And you guys are, because I think another thing some people don't understand is there's only certain drugs you can pick up in urine and then certain drugs you can pick up in blood, correct? So it's not necessarily you're going to find everything similar between the blood and the urine sample.
That's correct. Okay. Yeah, no, and that's, so the drugs themselves, pharmacology is broken down into two branches, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And the kinetics kinetics stands for movement. It's essentially the movement of the drug through the animal. And so that's my specialty, that's my background. And so when we're looking for a drug in either blood or urine, typically we're choosing the matrix that we think we're going to have the best likelihood of finding that drug. Now, if it's a therapeutic substance, then there are guidelines as to where to have a cutoff for those therapeutic substances in some cases. And so it just depends on which drug you're talking about as to whether the blood sample or the urine sample is going to be the best matrix. So we always try to get both. We would love to be able to have both matrices from every horse. That's the ideal world. When we don't get that, we do the best that we can with the matrices that we get.
Yeah, and with that also, I think at times you are either looking for the drug itself or you're looking for what kind of the drug breaks down to, correct? So there's times where like you may not actually find the actual drug, but you'll find a byproduct, I guess maybe for lack of a better term, that indicates the drug had been given.
Yeah.
Is that something that's kind of time dependent as well?
Sure,
okay.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, when we find a drug in the sample, we don't know how much was given. We don't know when it was given. There's really no way to figure that out specifically from a single sample. You need to have multiple samples in order to try and figure out a time course. However, we can look for, when we do the research at the lab, we are looking to see, well, do we want to look for the actual drug itself? Do we want to look for what's a metabolite of the drug? So when the drug is, given to the animal, immediately what starts to happen is that the liver and kidney start to work on that drug. And so the liver has lots of enzymes in it that will alter the drug and form what we call metabolites. And those metabolites are then typically eliminated in the urine. Sometimes they are in the bile or the feces as well. And we can also see them in the blood too. So depending on the drug, if we'll either look for the parent drug or we may look for a metabolite instead, and we may look for that metabolite in either blood or urine, or both in some cases. So it really depends on the drug, what we actually end up looking for. And the time course of that, there is a lot of research that's been published to figure out how long it takes to produce those metabolites and then how long we're able to detect those metabolites. But we don't have that for every drug.
Obviously, yeah. So you've now got, let's say if you've had your extraction, it's gone through the mass specs and all that. If that test comes out clean, that's kind of the end of the process, right? So
yes.
that horse is declared to at least be clear of the drugs you're potentially screening for. Do you guys hold those samples any further, or are they discarded at that point?
We do hold them for a period of time, but
Okay.
we don't have the capacity to hold them, obviously, indefinitely.
Oh yeah, no, obviously, as far as that goes. So I guess the next step would be, okay, it's gone through the screening process, something does flag as a potential or drug, I should say, or illicit substance or whatever.
We call it a suspect.
Suspect, yeah, so suspect. What happens to that sample next?
Yeah. So if we have a suspect during the screening process, then that gets moved on to the list for confirmation. And so a confirmation test is one that has been designed specifically for that drug. So it is a very specific test, and we're only looking for the drug of interest or its metabolite in some cases. And so it's a similar process to the screening test. We still do an extraction. We still have usually a liquid chromatograph that is separating it out from the plasma or the urine or serum. And then we still use a mass spec to look at the various pieces, the intact and the different pieces. However, these instruments and those processes have all been optimized for that particular analyte. And we have our laboratory is accredited to ISO 17025, which is an industry, it's not even just a racing industry, but it's a laboratory-wide, for chemical testing laboratories, it's a standard that we all need to meet when we're developing these methods that we're using to ensure that the method has been validated appropriately. And so during the development process, we have lots of steps that we go through to make sure that method for that particular analyte for confirmation that has all been met. And we do this for screening as well, but for a screening test, the validation is just to ensure that we're meeting the level of detection that we need to meet. And we're typically only looking at the most abundant fragment that is coming out of the instrument. So we don't need to look at all the different fragments. We could just look for one. And then when we go to the confirmation, we're going to look for all the different fragments to make sure that it really is the drug that we think it is in that sample.
And when you now get to kind of that confirmation stage or looking, will that give you, I mean, we hear and read about it all the time, like so many nanograms per ml or things like that.
Yes.
Is that where you get that actual reading number from?
Yes, depending on the method. So
Okay.
some analytes we are not required to quantify, and so we do have what we call qualitative methods. And for a qualitative method, for example, if it's something like dermorphin, which is an opioid from frog skin,
Yep.
if it's something that just should never be found in a racehorse, we don't have to quantify that necessarily. We always provide an estimated quantification for that, but we can we have qualitative screens we have qualitative confirmation methods for looking for substances that we don't need to quantify. And then for quantification purposes, the criteria that need to be met for accuracy and precision are much higher than for a qualitative method, and it requires a lot more work to develop and have a validated quantitative method than a validated qualitative method. Sorry, jumping over these words.
It's all, yeah, I know. It's really, they're all so similar. It's difficult to with that. But you touched on something that I think is really important too, and I think what some people have questions about is what kind of quality control is done in the labs and the machines to ensure that what you're seeing is actually what you're seeing.
Absolutely. So quality control, we have our senior quality control manager who has been with us for over 20 years. She is fantastic, and they essentially ensure that we are have all the SOPs in place, that we're meeting exactly what the ISO IEC 17025 standard says. We also are accredited to the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium accreditation program. We're going to be accredited to the HIWU, I apologize, I can't remember the acronym, but the new accreditation program that HISA is putting together. So all of those programs ensure that we are meeting the industry, meeting or exceeding the industry standard for drug testing. And there's lots of paperwork to go through to make sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's to meet all of those requirements. And we get audited so we do an internal audit on the years that we don't have an on-site audit, and then every other year we have an on-site audit. So every year there's an audit, and that we do throughout the entire lab to make sure that all of our processes are being followed. Within the actual tests themselves, there are criteria that have to be met in order for that test to be accepted as a pass. That the test itself has to pass in order for the data from that test to be used and accepted. So we have negative controls, we have positive controls. We have both solvent blanks, so the solvents and materials that are being used for the test itself that are run to make sure that there's absolutely nothing in those blanks that were used for the extraction procedures in the test itself. Then we have negative matrix, so we get our serum and plasma and urine from our research herd. We have horses in our herd that at New Bolton Center that we know have not received any drugs for at least a month or so usually. And so we always check to make sure those samples are not showing anything. And then the calibrators and QC samples that are used as part of the method, they also have to be consistent with what we're expecting to see. So they're spiked with the analyte of interest, and they have to be consistent with what we're expecting to see. So that's where the accuracy and the precision come in if we're doing a quantitative test. And then the blanks are consistent throughout the run as well. So within the sequence, we have to have blanks in between the various samples that we're running to show that there's no what we call carryover, so that the analyte is not carrying over from one sample to another.
So there can't be, I guess, with those blanks, you're preventing any possibility of contamination from one sample into another in reading, at least in the reading process, not
exactly. No, for sure. I mean the instrument and everything itself, because there's a needle that goes down and to collect the actual sample, right? And so that needle gets washed, and the blanks are to make sure that the wash was effective. Okay. So we make sure that there's absolutely no way that could have carried over like into a sample, for example.
Okay, so now we've gone now you've got a positive on the confirmatory, either just at a level of detection or at a number, depending on what they require. At that point, I'm assuming your guys' job is pretty much done as far as the confirmation, right? Unless they want further testing, correct? Like to confirm that result, or does the sample kind of just end?
No, at that point, once we finish the confirmation test, if we have a laboratory finding, then that gets reported to the client, whoever that is. And so our job is done after the confirmation test, and that's not to say it's not done when the instrument is done running, right? We have to analyze all the data, we put the report together, And then it goes through several levels of review within the lab before it actually gets released. So, so the analyst who has put the report together, the chemist, reviews it. We also have a senior chemist review all of the laboratory findings, and then we have a lab manager who reviews the laboratory findings, and then it comes to me for review as well. So it goes through several levels of review to make sure that all of the data that are generated are all consistent. There's no, everything looks like it's expected to look for a laboratory finding. Once that's all confirmed internally, then it gets released to the client. Usually as a one-pager, so there's a one-page document that is sent to say this is what we suspect and find and confirm. And then at that point, it's kind of out of our hands. I don't really have anything to do with the process once it goes to the client. That's up to the team, whoever has asked us to do the testing, to decide what happens next.
And just to kind of confirm, I know we talked about it kind of at the beginning, but still, even through that whole process up to where you give the one-pager, you still have no idea who the horse or anything is. It's just, you're basically going off a barcode number.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
No, we release it as, in this accession, each box that comes to our lab with the samples is labeled an accession.
Okay.
And so each accession has, maybe 15 to 20 samples, or more. Sometimes we'll have large accessions. And so we're essentially saying, okay, in this accession, sample number, whatever, had this drug. This drug was found in that sample as a laboratory finding.
Okay. So one other thing, just kind of on the confirmatory testing, because I know people read about this or you hear about trainers or owners sometimes requesting what they call kind of a B sample to be sent. So if you guys receive, because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of times, sometimes they can request a sample to be sent to a different accredited lab. So if you guys get a sample, let's say from a different lab, that they want run on the B sample, you kind of follow the same process, right?
Absolutely.
Of just confirming and then confirming the numbers.
Yes. In that case, we are going straight to the confirmation test.
Okay.
Because it's already been reported by another lab that that's what they found, and so it's, in that case, we're being asked to confirm that we also see that same substance in that sample.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. No, I mean, that's great. I think that kind of takes us through kind of towards the end there. And with those, if you do have a confirmed concern or something like that, but then are those samples held, let's say, for a longer period of time than the ones that would be cleared?
Absolutely. So the samples that have a laboratory finding are held typically at least a year. Okay. But if there's litigation, then they're maintained until the end of any type of litigation. So.
No, but that's great. Thank you so much for taking us through that process. We have a couple other things, that we're going to talk about. But I think hopefully that kind of helps people understand a little bit better the process of where the sample goes from start to finish, and how much. And what I think is really important is how much, and I didn't even know this, internal quality control there is in making sure that test is accurate and things like that. So that's, I think, really important for the public to know and for everybody else to know as far as testing for certain things. The next thing I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about was something else that's come up a lot recently, and I think it's a modality of testing that people are questioning a lot about, especially in the racing world, and that's kind of hair testing. And I know there's really not a ton of testing that is done on hair for a lot of samples, but I want to know if you could just go through sort of the process of how hair testing would be done looking for something, and why hair is such a great kind of like medium for finding certain substances and stuff.
Yeah,
like that.
Absolutely. So, I mean, hair, we really just see hair as another matrix. So instead of a blood sample or a urine sample, we can also test a hair sample. The hair itself will have, when the animal gets the drug, it can get incorporated into the hair as the hair is growing. So, if an animal, like clenbuterol is a big one that I'm sure everybody has heard, is being tested for in hair. So when the animal gets clenbuterol, it's actually incorporated into the hair as the hair is growing. And so we can take a length of hair, and you can either do, the whole hair, it's like a whole clump of hairs itself, or you can chop it into pieces and get kind of like a timeline as to when the horse may have been exposed. It doesn't give you a specific date or anything like that. Like, it's not that accurate. But you can look at like, okay, was it toward the end of the hair segments or was it toward the beginning of the hair segments? That may give you an idea as to how recently the exposure may have occurred, if that's important to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's in quarter horses, they've banned it completely, so any finding would be a violation. But the advantage that gives you is that, you have a chance to detect that for a longer period of time than you would actually see it in either plasma or urine for some drugs. So again, it's very drug dependent. Research has to be performed to see if it will actually be incorporated into the hair at all. And so, and then the methodology also has to be validated, and just like we do for plasma or urine, we still have all the quality controls and things that we need to do. It's a little bit different with the hair because we're taking a grinder. It's essentially a way to pulverize the hair, to be able to break it up so that we can then do the extraction with the chemical solutions and things after we pulverize the hair. So that requires a good bit more just quality control. Obviously you want to clean the grinder
Yep, definitely.
very well. And we also have control hair that we get from our research horses as well to use for our calibrators and things like that, and QCs. We're the concentration estimates are not as, we do still estimate concentration, but they're usually at lower concentrations, and so there's not, it's usually more of a plus or minus, do we see it or not, for a hair test. But there are, I think the biggest advantage is that you can detect certain drugs for a much longer period of time. So if it's a banned substance that just should never be given, then hair testing is really a good matrix for that, or could be.
Yeah, if everything goes up. Is there a certain type of hair from the horse that is better for testing than another? I know horses will grow their coats out and stuff like that, but do you look for like mane hair or tail hair, or what's? It's
typically, we typically like to use mane hair. You can do hair testing on tail hair as well. There's nothing wrong with that. But the mane hair, I think, is just a little bit, I don't know. It's easier for people to get, that people don't like pulling tail hairs. And it's growing fairly consistently, like at a consistent rate. Whereas I feel like the tail hairs are just growing a little bit slow. I honestly don't know. I haven't done any studies to see how rapidly the mane hair grows versus the tail hair, but my impression is that the mane hair just grows at a more consistent rate, and so you're going to get maybe a more consistent sample.
And there would be a certain, if somebody was looking to do that, there's a certain amount of hair you guys require, right?
Yes.
In order to validate the test and make sure that.
So we always say, I don't know how many people actually use pencils anymore, but number 32 pencil width, if you can get, number 32 pencil width of hair, that's a good amount. And you can either pull it or cut it. If you want to also do DNA testing, then it's better to pull it because you're going to get the hair root, and then you can do DNA testing with that. But we can certainly do the chemical testing on either a pulled or a cut sample. It really, either way is fine.
So for the DNA testing, you're talking about just confirming that hair came from that horse? Is that what you're, okay.
Yeah. That's a different test.
Yeah, that's what I figured. I remember reading a little bit about that in a couple of cases where they were looking to confirm that what they were seeing truly came from that horse. So, that's really interesting. Do you see potentially in the future testing going more in that direction as far as focusing more on hair than blood and urine, or is it just kind of we don't know yet?
I don't think. I think at least with current technology, the ability to multiplex, I think with hair is not as great as we can do with the blood and urine. So we've got screens that have over 500 compounds in them, and maybe it's just time that we need to be able to add more and more compounds to the hair, but we're certainly not there yet. So I don't know. I really can't say. It would be nice to be able to do hair testing and not have to get a blood sample, but at the same time, it's kind of hard to get a hair sample from a horse that's just run a race too. So
yeah, that's probably not, they're probably not amenable to most sampling, but hair definitely.
They surprise you. Yeah. I've sampled racehorses, and it depends on the horse.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, that's great. So that's really good in hearing about the hair testing and stuff, because I know that's a question I think that's come up a lot, and especially for certain drugs. Clenbuterol obviously is the big one because everybody hears about that, but there's been talk about some others that people have said, well, why can't they do it in humans? Why can't we just test everything with hair? And obviously there's a difference there in doing the two. So So no, that's great. Thank you so much for that information.
And even in humans, like there's some analytes that they look for in hair, and then there's other analytes that they look for in urine. So
okay.
yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And that brings to a close part 1 of our sit-down interview with Dr. Mary Robinson of the PETRL lab. I hope that kind of answered some questions that people may have had, and there were a lot of things even I didn't realize, and I dig into this stuff pretty deeply, into just the intricacy and the quality control and the research and all of the diligence that goes into ensuring that those samples that are tested in the most rigorous way possible, and that when they do find a positive, they are really pretty sure that what's in there is in there. So I hope everybody kind of found that informative and interesting. As always, if there's any questions that may have popped up watching that interview, certainly drop them in the comments. Certainly give us a shout here at Thoroughfan. I will follow up with Dr. Robinson to see if she can answer them, and if she can't or I can't, we definitely will find them for you. Part 2 will be coming out in a little bit, and that's where we delve a little bit more into some topics I think that a lot of racing fans and the public have questions about nowadays, which is, well, why can't we just test for any new substance? And if somebody's cheating, why can't we just find that substance right away? It's not quite that simple, as you will see when that part 2 comes out. We also delve a little bit into the concept of biopassports, and while those are used a lot in the human sports testing world, they're not quite ready for prime time in the equine racing world yet. So that part 2 certainly will be out in a little bit, so look for that. Hope everybody is enjoying the start to Derby season. It's certainly starting to ramp up a lot, and we're starting to see some really impressive performances even in just the prep races. It's looking like it's going to be a really interesting Derby trail this year, and it looks like it's going to be a really exciting older horse division with a lot of really top 3-year-olds of last year returning as 4-year-olds this year, which is something I can tell you as a fan, and fans all over have been really waiting to see. So hopefully these horses will, meet up in multiple races this year and really duke it out to see who is the top older horse in the country come Breeders' Cup time and the end of 2025. So again, I am Doc for Thoroughfan, and as always, if you, the racing fan, are looking for the most accurate and up-to-date information about this great sport of thoroughbred racing put on by us, the racing fan, there's only one place you need to turn, and that is right here at Thoroughfan.